Good everyone. I hope you guys have an amazing day. In the last episode, we briefly touched about the basics of the carbon accounting. Now, in this episode, we're going to look at something about how to track emission for stationary asset. I do you remember that I covered this topic briefly in one of the episodes when I was talking about how to allocate carbon credits, right? Now, I wanted to go a little bit more deeper because if you remember, I did mention that I will be talking in detail. So now it's very important when we talk about carbon emission, how to take stock of your building, right? Because obviously, the place where you work, your building or your data center, um, does contribute to a certain amount of carbon emission. And obviously, if you as a business wants to target net zero by say 2030 or 2050, then you need to take into consideration different source of emission and work your way up to make sure that you are offsetting that emission. Okay, so now if you wanted to take a stock of your building, right? So that's where all stationary asset environment source object will come into place. So it's pretty much the same what I've demonstrated last time. You click on new and create an asset environment source record. So I'll pick one just for the sake of argument. And then I have to, no, not this one. Let's pick something. I don't know which one to pick. Um, let's say recently viewed. Um, let's see if I can pick office waste. No, it doesn't. Doesn't seem like a good example. Okay, doesn't matter. I'll pick one, right? Let's say I pick the Japan US region. Okay. All right. So when you look at this record, right, there are few things you need to pay very special attention to. Though some of the fields are non-mandatory, but I just still wanted to cover. The first thing is the carbon emission scope allocation. Okay. As you can look at this, as you can see that there's a help task which pretty much says um, to specify the carbon emission scope allocation record to override default scope emission for all the fuel type. Um, so now you must be thinking, what the heck this even supposed to mean, right? Because obviously the help is not very useful. If you are coming to Net Zero Cloud for the first time, and if you're not really tech savvy, if you're just a business owner and wanted to capture carbon emission, this freaking text make no sense whatsoever. Okay, so what does that mean is that, right, this field helps user, right, specify the scope to which emission from each fuel is allocated in simple terms. So now this specific object, obviously you store this information in an object, right? Because if you look here, you have an option to create a new record. Okay. So this object specify, greenhouse emission protocol scope of emission for different fuels. Okay. So, let's say I have a fuel one, fuel two, fuel three. Okay. So each fuel type has its own scope allocation record in the carbon scope allocation value object, which we already looked at it in one of the episodes. That's in a nutshell what this is about, if you're wondering, okay? Because obviously, when I looked at the health documentation, it's shite. I didn't get anything out of it, to be honest. Salesforce really need to work on improving the help documentation. Sorry, the help text. Okay, now the same thing goes to refrigerant emission factor. Okay, let's see what it means. Specify the refrigerant emission factor that used to calculate emission based on. Okay, this one makes um, more sense. Okay, so in this, what happens? So let me pick one. Okay, let me pick one, right? And or what I'll do, okay, I will go to tic tac toe icon and I will say refrigerant emission factor. I go to separate tab, okay, and I will pick one. Okay, so first of all, what is this object is all about? All right, why do we need this? Okay, so this specific object it holds the global warming potential. That is uh, a value which we also call it as GWP, right? It's for cooling refrigerants such as HFCs and CFCs, right? Which is yeah. So I'll show you an example in a second to explain to you what it means, right? So that's each record in this object holds. Okay, so let's look at this one. Okay, now if you so this is the data emission data source which get used for the calculation. Okay, as you can see here. And this is the field I was talking about, global warming potential. So now, why do we need this one, right? You must be wondering. Okay, so the reason why we need, if you wanted to properly calculate the metric tons of carbon dioxide from refrigerant leakage, if you remember in the last episode, I did mention every fuel type is will equate to metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so if you look from that perspective, we are looking at calculating um, um, the metric tons from the refrigerant leakage. Now, how to work out that figure or that amount, sorry, that value? To do that, you need to multiply this specific value times the quantity of refrigerant leakage, times, right? The quantity. So for that reason, we use this flag. So that's one of the reasons why we have this object in place where we store the record. I hope that is a little bit clear, right? So I'm trying to make it easier for you guys just to understand what it means, right? I do appreciate the fact that it's a little bit tricky because of calculation. And as we go down the chain, you will see the calculation is going to get a little bit more complicated. But stay with me. I'll try to explain in a very simple way. Okay. All right. So that's cool, right? We park this aside. Now there's something called electricity emission factors, right? This one, I mean, I did briefly mention, right? And I said, we talked about Japan or Canada, different stuff. So, okay, let's look at, like I did. So, electricity emission factor set, right? Now, what is this object for, right? What's the purpose of this object? You must be wondering, why do we have so many different, standard objects, which comes with a net zero cloud? Why do we need this one? Okay, so to answer that question, so this object, specific object, it holds a range of information, which is equivalent to calculate the scope 2 emission generated from the electricity. So if you wanted to calculate the scope 2 emission, right, generated from electricity, you need to have a record in this specific object. So that's one of the reasons why we use this object. Okay. Now, the greenhouse emission protocol provides two methods for tracking scope 2 emissions. One is the market based, and the second is the location based. Okay. Just remember for now the two ways to track it: market based and location based. Okay. We'll talk about this in the future. So just for now, just store that in your neurocortex memory, wherever it is, right? Just store this information. Okay, so now let's look at one of the record, right? Any record, and obviously you can look at Japan, but for now, just to give you a context. Okay, as usual, like we have for the carbon stuff, we have the same emission factor data source, um, and which is obviously used to calculate electricity-based emission in a specific postal code. So this is important. You just go through it if you're interested, because you need to calculate based on your postal code, right? Your city or suburb you live in, right? So yeah, and this information all contains location-based and market-based. So these are the two things I mentioned, right? There are two types. You remember I mentioned location-based and market-based, right? So this is a value here, right? Okay, so that's hopefully that's been okay for you guys to know, I guess. Hopefully that's clear. Okay, now what the heck is other emission, right? We talked about carbon emission, refrigerant emission, electricity emission, and how much emissions I do have to worry about, like, because now as a business owner, I'm getting overwhelmed, right? I'm just getting frustrated to know how much stuff to capture, because it's too much to capture, right? Don't you worry, right? It's just one more tiny stuff to worry about. Um, so other emission. Okay, let's look at other emission factors, right? Right. Other emission factor set. Okay, what is this object is for? Like, other objects we looked at, right? The standard object. This holds a predefined uh, emissions and conversion factors for emissions, which could be from your natural gas or your diesel or petrol or whatever, right? Um, so yeah, that's the main in nutshell, right? It holds the predefined emission and conversion factors. Okay. Um, so now you must be thinking, okay, now isn't it the same for electricity? What we just discussed? Well, all the individual emissions and conversion factors, right, for the sources that are not included in electricity grid or scope 3 are actually calculated as a part of it. So anything which is outside we discussed will get included here. So for now, just remember that. Okay, that's all you need to know. Okay, now when we looked at it, and this is about your building details, right? The floor and occupation, occupied floor area. Excuse me, and the address is in Japan, Kyoto. My apologies if I pronounce the city wrong. Certain cities I can't pronounce like a native speaker, right? So my apologies for that, because I do not know how a Japanese will pronounce the city name in their own language in Japanese. So my apologies. Um, so that's one thing. If I cancel this, right? If I go to related list, you will see the stationary asset energy use. Um, so which is cool. Now you must be wondering, all right, what the heck is this? What is this for? We just now looked at different kinds. Now what is this for? Right. So buildings, right? Maybe your buildings, which you own, or warehouses you own, or other places you own. They often use maybe electricity or diesel inverters, whatever, right, for backup generators. And they you might be using refrigerators. If it's a meat processing plant, they will have coolers, refrigerators, right, to store the frozen meat, right. So each of these require separate energy record. Like for instance, cooling. Okay, cooling of, so if you're running a butcher store, right, if you're running a pretty big butcher store, for instance, right, you store meat. Sometimes you sell the frozen meat, so you might be needing a big refrigerator to store the meat so that it can freeze, right, your sausages, or you know lamb shanks, or the venison cut or fillets or whatever, right. I'm just giving an example. So you need that, right? So that machine, which cools this thing down or freezes the meat, consumes energy, right? And that needs to be stored in the form of energy record. So if you look at one, right? So this is how it looks like. So it contains information like building size, report details, from what day do you want to report on, energy consumption values. So you have fuel consumptions here, the cooling type, and you have fuel consumption total, and different emission types, electricity emission factors, this all stuff, right? And there's different fields that get calculated here, location grid metrics, renewable energy allocation. All of this stuff gets calculated. Now, some of the calculations are interesting, um, which is, I would say, for instance, if you wanted to calculate, um, location-based emissions, right? Somewhere is it? Yeah, so it's scope 2 location-based emission, right? So this value. Um, so now you must be wondering, how does this got generated? So there is a simple calculation. So to get to this value, you need to multiply electricity consumption times emission factors divided by your metric tons of carbon dioxide conversion factor. So, in a nutshell, that's the calculation that goes behind the scene, right? So, the same goes with the scope 1 emission, which is pretty much equivalent to supplied uh, carbon dioxide emission factor times total fuel consumption divided by 1,000. So I don't really want to get into the details of the calculation, but just to give you an idea, right, how you can store value to track your asset-based carbon emission. So there are a lot of things that goes behind the scene. I do appreciate the fact that it can be a little bit confusing, but just from a beginner perspective, I think this information is sufficient. But as you dive deeper into Net Zero Cloud, I would highly encourage you to go and read the documentation. You will find more valuable information out there, right? So yeah, that's all I wanted to cover in this episode. I hope this section is a bit valuable because I do appreciate, like I said, it's a bit challenging to go through lots of different information. I do understand that some of the help text documentation is shite, which I personally believe Salesforce should at least pay a bit more attention to. To make it more user friendly, the information they're releasing out to the user, because not everyone is a tech savvy, right? There must be business people, there must be a business user or a help desk user. I mean, if I have sorry, if I have a help desk team, right? I don't have a help desk team, right? Most of the stuff I do it myself, or my business founder, co-founder, she does it when she get time, or we have developers, but they normally don't get involved in this kind of things, right? Because obviously it's founders who does it. So if I don't have a help desk team to help me with it, so if I'm a tech savvy guy, right? I'm not just a functional guy. I'm a techno functional. I understand technology very well. So even for me to understand the health test, it was a bit challenging. So imagine for someone who has no idea about this kind of thing, sorry, these kind of things, right? So that makes it very difficult. So that's why I would appreciate if Salesforce would have done a little bit extra, right? Who are built it to pay a little bit more attention from a user perspective. So otherwise, this tool is spot on, right? It does what it's supposed to do. So yeah, that's all I wanted to cover in this episode. I hope you guys have an amazing Thursday. Adios.